Good evening, everyone. Today I have the honor of introducing the second Goggio lecture of the year. And I do it on behalf of our chair, Professor Luca Somigli, who is attending a conference in Europe, so here tonight. For this lecture, we have two speakers. Our Goggio visiting professor, Michelangelo Zaccarello, who is a professor of Italian philology at the University of Pisa and president of ICON, Italian Culture of the Med. As I mentioned last week, Professor Zaccarello is a specialist in early Italian literary texts and digital philology. He has been visiting professor in several North American universities and in European universities. He has widely published, not only in Italy, but also in Europe and US. And among his recent publications, I can mention some publication on textual scholarship, l'edizione critica del testo letterario, Mondadori 2017, Teorie e forme del testo digitale, Carrocci 2019, and Leggere senza libri, Cesati 2020. The other speaker is Anna Terroni, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Pisa. She worked on Italian women writers of the 19th and 20th century. In particular, she has focused on revaluation of Caroline Vernizia's production, who is can be considered as a pioneering writer in the establishment of the detective story, and particularly in its codification as a female genre. Anna Terroni is currently working on the first modern critical edition of a 16th century comedy, Alessandro Donzellini's The Excess of Love and Fortune, which is the title of today's lecture. And of this comedy, The Earliest Witness, published in 1572, is in US at the Beinecke Library of Yale University. So I pass the floor on our guests, and I welcome them to University of Toronto. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Franco. Thank you very much for this extraordinary opportunity that I have. I thanked you last week. I do this week also on behalf of Anna, who's just arrived from Italy, still a bit jet lag, but she's here, and that's the most important thing. And today we are tackling a very interesting methodological issue, because dramatic texts, as we shall see, have a certain degree of variation at several levels of their production and the fruition. We can adopt a category of textual mobility for the staging of Renaissance drama. We must face the textual variation of extant witnesses with the specific editorial techniques. And our case study, which shortly will be introduced by Anna, is precisely a good example of such variation with very different versions that are surviving till the present day. First of all, the category of textual mobility move-ons is established for medieval texts by the very famous scholar Posintor in his 1972 book Essai de poétique médiévale. And this kind of variation applies both to authoriality, which spans through a very diverse range of contributions. Medieval authors are essentially compilatores, to obviously the actual performance of the text in front of several different audiences. In this book, the dynamics of production and transcription and the various forms of circulation of these texts are defining a context which is all but linear. We are used to tackle the textual scholarship of early text by means of schematics or stematology, citing a recent manual published by Cambridge, Handbook of Stematology. However, stematology implies a linear and A to B nature of transcription of textual descent. In the case of medieval texts, or at least of a number of genres that we can list for medieval literature, such as chivalric poems or life sustains, this variation spans from the language or dialect to more substantial forms of rewriting and the rearrangement of the entire works. Therefore, without a linear kind of genealogy, no reconstruction in the neo-Lachmannian sense is possible. What the edition should aim for, in Zumthor's word, is the complex unity constituted by the collectivity of the material versions that survive. And this edition should target, in Zumthor's words, a single document in its complex production context. This kind of concept of textual move-ons applies very well to several vernacular genres. As I said before, romances and chansons de geste, lyric poetry, fabliaux, and so forth. However, in later literature, and particularly, as we shall argue today, in early modern drama, we shall find a number of similar issues which must be taken into account. From multiple authoriality, Anna will mention a comedy, Gli Ingannati, which is collectively signed by the Academies degli Intronati, one of the earliest examples of dramas by the Intronati, to the various forms of staging of such plays, depending on factors that will be investigated. Single text editing, according to Zumthor, can account for the variety of the extant witnesses. In our case, the enormous degree of variation between one and another version would also account for the need of either a digital edition, an archive of extant versions, or a single text one. These are obviously performative texts, and performative texts were subject to multiple production and reception coordinates: stage location, dimensions, number of actors, social and cultural audience targeted, the taste and preferences of patrons who are endorsing the performance, and indeed theatrical companies who more often than not were purchasing the text from the author and acquired full rights of changing and adapting it to different occasions. Performances could be either public, as we shall see for the Accademia degli Intronati, or private, and could be taking place during public feasts such as Carnival typically, or other religious holidays, or perhaps celebrations of specific military and or political events, coronations, diplomatic treaties, weddings, baptisms, and so forth. If we want to quote an example from the Siena after the acquisition of Siena by the Grand Duke of Tuscany, Cosimo, that is after the Treaties of Château-Cambrésis of 1555, we can cite the wedding of Grand Duke Ferdinando de' Medici with Cristina de Lorena, which is an event which was prepared very carefully and which featured the close cooperation of both Sienese and Florentine artists. For example, Girolamo Bargagli, the author of Dialogo dei Giochi, famous dialogue, comedy La Pellegrina, staged with complex architectural scenographies by Buontalenti and music by Rinuccini, Bardi, and Caccini, who are protagonists of the very famous Camerata de Bar. In this case, we must draw a very clear-cut distinction between theatre, which was intended to be performed with music, musical drama, and theatre which was based on words, teatro di parola, as it has been defined. In general, the concept is that theatre which was set to music had to be made available to the audience prior to their performance so that people could more or less follow regardless of the sort of singing that was carried out. And indeed, the publication in print of those texts was carried out not only by the authors, this was actually a rare event, but more often than not by the same company that was staging the text. So, as you can see, one single drama entails a number of factors and contexts which can lead to extreme textual variation. The written word, the author reality, the literary work in the sort of mainstream sense is only the starting point of a play. The dramatic text then takes different shapes according to components which are sometimes difficult to reconstruct. Patrons, festivities, actors, companies, audiences. Anna Scannapieco defines the actual literary text as the motore primo of the comedy, which nonetheless is only the beginning of the composition, reception, history of the work. Therefore, in terms of authoriality, we can talk about an interactive authoriality that did not grant the text any form of stability, because the text had to find a relative profile only once the number of actors and the dimension of stage and other contextual factors were actually determined. That's how, among extant witnesses, we find an incredible variety of documents, such as stage copies, author revisions of many kinds, fair copies, as in your case, or perhaps scrapbooks. multiple interactive authoriality means that there were, more often than not, co-authors. Impresarios, for example, who acquire the rights to revise and publish the text. Actors who could propose and adopt several varianti di messa in scena, stage variants that were deemed to fit the situation better. The sources, because obviously sometimes it was felt that a certain passage or one of the many stock characters was not alluding clearly enough to its Latin source. For example, one of the most famous comedies of the first period, that is Bernardo Dovizzi, Il Bibbiena Scalandria, is an adaptation from Plauto's Menechmi. And the staging of this comedy was masterminded by Baldassar Castiglione, so one of the most prominent characters of the time, and even the learned origin of character and plot. There are variants which seem to strive to make clearer that a certain element is drawn from Plautus. And indeed, the stock characters are very typical, Anna will talk about this too, very typical of this kind of Latin rooting of this kind of texts. The cunning servant, the elderly lover, the pedantic teacher, are all characters that will become so standard to actually turn into masks of the Commedia dell'arte, shortly to happen. Connection to Carnival is one of the many factors that seem to unite both this period and the 17th century. The bond with architecture. Not only were many of the scenographers of such comedies famous architects, but in some cases a specific adaptation of Vitruvius or other Latin treatises works were made to produce extraordinary and impressive scenographies which leave a deep mark in contemporary chronicles. Marin Sanudo, for example, talks about this in his diaries. In the 1540s, the Academies delle Virtù, for example, embarked in a revision of Vitruvius' text to produce a number of architectural outcomes, among which were theater scenographers and famous architects of the time, Serlio, Palladio, Vignola, were participating in this. In Siena, which is the context that Anna will shortly be talking about, these kind of events were very carefully coordinated. The staging was very often carefully prepared by architects and artists, and city academies, the Rozzi first, but very soon the Academies degli Intronati, were taking care of the organization. The popularity of the Intronati can be easily argued by looking at one of their most famous members, Alessandro Piccolomini, who is a paramount figure of Italian culture of the time, professor at the University of Padua, and director of a prospected play to be performed in Siena, Sperone Speroni's Canace, which was to be performed by the most famous actor of the time, that is Angelo Beolco, called Il Ruzzante. This event didn't take place only because Ruzzante himself died in 1542. Our case study today will be an unknown comedy of this time by an accademico intronato, as we shortly see, and the years in which the story will be set are exactly the important years of the fully developed theatre, between the editio princeps of the play, which is 1585, the same year in which Teatro Olimpico of Vicenza was opened, to the second edition, which happens a few years after the cited wedding between Ferdinando and Cristina di Lorena. So please welcome Anna Terroni.
So my contribution in today's lecture will focus on the research project I'm currently working on, a project that started very recently and will be presented as such. So the aim of my talk is to highlight the main and complex dynamics that have emerged from extant material examination, which demonstrate the importance of furthering the study of this work, the comedy Gli oltraggi d'Amore di Fortuna, in English, The Excesses of Love and Fortune, then unpublished in modern times, and of its author who has remained obscure until now. So firstly, I'd like to briefly illustrate Alessandro Donzellini's biographical coordinates and a short summary of the synopsis of his comedy, The Excesses of Love and Fortune. Then I would go on to analyze the text tradition to show how various changes are present in it, aimed at adapting the comedy to the performative context of its representation. So, Alessandro Donzellini was born between 1542 and 1545 in Bolsena, Lazio, where he lived with his family and died in 1613. During his life, he held various public offices in his hometown. He was chancellor, notary, and even prior. But what's most interesting for our proposed discussion is certainly Donzellini's literary activity was part of the Accademia degli Intronati under the name of Stordito, which means, we can say, dumbstruck or something like that. So, the Accademia degli Intronati, founded in 1525, took this name to signify the desire of the founders to withdraw from the noise of the world, from which they were as if stunned, intronati precisely, to dedicate themselves to comedies and studies of language and literature. The beginning of the Intronati's dramaturgical experimentation is traditionally considered 1531, when the comedy Gli Ingannati, in English The Deceived, was staged and signed collectively by the academics, as we have just said. A particularly significant element to understand the activity and, we can say, commitment of the Intronati is, for example, their active participation in the celebrations for Emperor Charles V's stay in Siena in 1536. The staging of a play, L'amor costante, in English, The Constant Love, precisely for this occasion cannot be considered an occasional event, but a precise intention of ideological and political alignment of particularly influential intellectuals. Returning now to Donzellini's production, his works include numerous historical, hagiographical, and dramatic works. In particular, his theatrical production counts a tragedy, The Tyria. Then we have two comedies published during the author's lifetime, The Tempesta Amorosa, in English, Love Storm, and our comedy, The Excesses of Love and Fortune. Then we have another comedy, The Madonna Raffaella, published only posthumously. The synopsis of our comedy is extremely intricate, following the typical pattern of 16th century dramatic text, in whose tradition our play fits. So, against the backdrop of Ottavio Farnese's Roman palace, this story stages through complex events the contrast between love and fortune, dear to that time culture. The scheme, as you can see in this slide, is as follows. Olympia, known as Iphigenia, loves Cleandro, who is, however, in love with Amata, who in turn loves Parthenia, who is instead in love with Olympia. This first love chain is effective enough to render the complexity of the plot, but that's not the end, because these main characters are surrounded by a whole series of characters, or better, stock characters, as we have said, typical of the comic genre. the greedy old father, the unscrupulous courtesan, the faithful servant and the foolish one, the captain, a vile scoundrel. All characters which anticipate the commedia dell'arte's characters. The plot unfolds without a real ending and leads to the reunion of Olympia and Parthenia. Parthenia reveals that he was freed from the slavery in which Turks held him after the Battle of Lepanto in 1571 and settled in Rome because he thought his beloved future wife Olympia was dead. But Olympia believed Parthenia to be dead too. So when she discovers the truth, the two are reunited and the other love affairs are solved accordingly. Although Donzellini's production is considered marginal, we can say, to this day, proof of the appreciation he received among his contemporaries is the recent discovery that Pier Francesco Cambi, one of the first Crusca academicians who worked on the composition of the lexicographical entries for the first Vocabolario della Crusca between 1591 and 1593, also carried out, among others, even the annotation of the play we are interested in, of which he recorded and pointed out some significant idioms and linguistic usages, as you can see in the following slide, in which I have inserted an image of the original manuscript that contains the lexicographical work of Pier Francesco Cambi that I have analyzed in the Accademia della Crusca's archive. And I think this fact validates the fundamental importance of the recovery and in-depth analysis of Donzellini's production. Coming now to the outline of the extant weaknesses of our play, the first discovered is a manuscript on paper, lacking attribution, preserved at the Beinecke Library, Yale University, New Haven. The manuscript is a fair copy, dated 1572. It contains the play's prologue, the list of the characters, and then the text of the play organized in 5 acts. A good 13 years after the Yale's manuscript, we have the first edition, printed in Florence by Bartolomeo Sermartelli in 1585. Bartolomeo Sermartelli, who was even the publisher of the Dante's Comedy annotated by Academies della Crusca in 1595. The princeps opens on a section addressed to the dedicative of the work Orazio Conti, which is followed by a short fable starring gods of Olympus that we can say reinterprets Aesop's classical fables in an ironic key, which is addressed to the readers. Then we have the prologue, the list of the characters, and then the text of the play, again organized in 5 acts. In addition to the princeps, which survives in 13 copies, the second printed edition of the play that is preserved in 8 surviving copies is dated 1592 and printed again for Sermartelli's time. Then, last but not least, we have another weakness, the last weakness discovered, but one of the most interesting, I can say, a manuscript on paper recently found and preserved in the Biblioteca Comunale of Siena. The manuscript, also of a certain authorship, appears to be a fair copy, dated 1592. Lacking the prologue, the manuscript contains the list of the characters and then the text, this time organized in 4 acts. In fact, a first inspection of the Sienese manuscript revealed a profound difference between the text preserved by the other witnesses and the text preserved in the Sienese one. It could perhaps be a completely new reduction of the play aimed at a new performance context. In any case, the study of the structural variants of this weakness and their relevance to the textual tradition will have to be assessed through a more in-depth analysis of the weakness. After these preliminary informations, let us move on to the central part of my presentation, which aims through a comparison between the Yale's manuscript and the first printed edition to demonstrate how the text staging can be, we can say, justified as a simplification of the performance. First of all, it should be specified that not only is the Sienese manuscript very different to the Yale's one, but even the Yale's manuscript itself, which predates the printed edition, differs considerably from the princeps, which, let us remember, is dated 1585. Since this is a work in progress that we have just begun, and since unfortunately time available is short, the comparison will focus on the analysis of a strategic textual point within the structure of the comedy, the prologue, and of 2 scenes chosen as a sample from the Yale's manuscript and then compared with the corresponding scenes within the princeps. So, first of all, The most obvious difference at a glance is the one regarded with the organization of the prologue. While the prologue in the manuscript is a continuous prose one which occupies the space of little more than 2 folios, in the print it is preceded by a dedication to Orazio Conti and a part for the readers. Then the actual prologue takes the form of a dialogue between 2 characters, the personification of prologue, allegory of light, and sterope, allegory of night. Proceeding in order, the prologue of the Yale's manuscript that you can see in this slide takes the form of a foreword for extraneous to the action itself, in which the narrators address his audience directly with a programmatic purpose. It specifies the play's subject matter, its location, and its aim. Particularly interesting, and not very frequent we can say in 16th century comic text, is the fact that the prologue of the manuscript refers not only to the scenic representation of the comedy, but also to the theatrical text reading as a text of entertainment and pleasure with an edifying function. You will only need the very content of the comedy which you shall be able to read in your households in order to learn how to escape vices and acquire good customs, costumi modesti we can say in Italian. Of a completely different nature is the prologue of the princeps that, having abandoned prose, resorts to be a recited and allegorical prologue, according to the model set by Plautus and Terence. The dialogue takes place between 2 characters who later take no part in the story. We have already said, Sterope, the allegory of night, and the prologue, traditionally presented as dressed in a white robe and crowned with a laurel, here personification of light. Here too, the discourse focuses on the teaching that the play proposes. Only in strong souls lives pure love, because they are capable of overcoming fortune by resorting to intellect and virtue. Turning now shortly to the analysis of the scenes, I would start with the analysis of Act 1, Scene 2. If in the Yale's manuscript the second scene is occupied by a monologue of the character Pedante, differently in the princeps the second scene is occupied by a dialogue between Olympia, known as Iphigenia, and her wet nurse, Ercolina, which appears instead as the third scene of Act 1 in the Yale's manuscript. Comparing 2 other scenes, this time from Act 3, if in the Yale's manuscript the 6th scene has Pedante, Cleandre, and Moschetto as protagonists, the 6th scene of the princeps corresponds to the 7th of the Yale's manuscript, in which we have Rutilio, Rondone, and Vignarolo. As may be suggested by such brief comparison, not only in the organization of the initial part of the play, but also in the internal structure of the acts, there are numerous structural variants between the Yale's manuscript, dated 1572, and the princeps, which is more than 10 years later. So, in conclusion, the aim of my discussion was to highlight the main differences that came out between the Yale's manuscript and the print, with the purpose of supporting the hypothesis that these changes were most likely made to make the play more performable. In this sense, if we accept that the textual mobility proceeds from the manuscript to the print and not vice versa, even from the cited examples, it is clear that indeed the changes would have precisely had this purpose. As shown, for example, by the dialogical rendering of the prologue, in order to make it more vividly staged through a dialogue, which is indeed easier for the audience to follow than a narrator's forward. For example, by the elimination of single voices scenes, and by the removal of some minor characters, such as Pedante, which would have complicated the performance on stage if one thinks, for example, that the same actor has to play different roles, and this created quite a few problems, especially if the number of actors was small. So the very unstable nature of this text demands an in-depth analysis of the variance among the witnesses and of the Sienese manuscript, which indeed seems to constitute a completely different reduction of the text, as proof of what we have just said. So certainly the excesses of love and fortune represents a particularly interesting case study that reaffirms in its staging the fact that in the field of dramatic textuality there is no standard version of the text, but as many versions as were required by different performance contexts. And thank you for the attention.
Thank you,
everyone. Thank you, Michelangelo, for this wonderful double lecture. I think we have around 20 minutes for questions, remarks, and then Michelangelo taking
In
questions.
either Italian or English,
Yes.
as you like.
And
You see, there's a majority of Italian native speakers in the audience, so we are very, very happy to answer Italian questions.
First of all, thank you so much, both for your interesting presentation on the comparisons of different manuscripts and texts, but also just in general talking about this concept of textual mobility. I had a question that was a bit more general. I'm not actually sure whether it can be answered based off of what your past experience, either of you, or experiences would be. Exploring textual mobility, but I was curious as to whether it was possible to notice any differences between the textual mobilities of, let's say, a commedia erudita or a commedia dell'arte, in which they're just different. Commedia erudita might be based off of a written text, whether in Latin or Greek. It would be performed by non-professional actors, usually for a court or a private space, versus the commedia dell'arte. You have a group of professional actors, you have canovacci, you have a spectacle for the public under certain circumstances. I was curious about whether you could speak to the differences, if there are any, about comparisons that are made or conversations that are had between different texts or people involved in the works.
Thank you very much. I'll take this one,
Yes,
if you
yes.
don't mind. There's a wonderful article by Pier Mario Vescovo in a journal called Commedia dell'arte, which tackles exactly this aspect. That is a sort of continuum, because it's impossible to draw a distinction between comedies which were written as impalcature by their authors, and scenarios which were performed by actors by filling out words for every situation, according to character, situation, and so on. In both cases, it was a matter of turning a scenario, turning a context into a written text, into words. Written words, as far as authors are concerned, spoken words as far as actors are concerned. But it would be a mistake, argues Vescovo, and I think that Pier Mario Vescovo is one of the most outstanding scholars of this period as far as dramatic texts are concerned. It would be a mistake to draw a clear-cut distinction between texts which were written originally for the reading and texts which were sort of suggested for the performers to improvise. This is not the case. Very often the same text would be adapted for both purposes. In the case of Donzellini's The Oltraggi, we know for a fact that the printed edition was intended to be read, not performed, because the prologue says is addressing the readers and is talking about the act of reading the comedy. Sorry. In other cases, it's in a way a different thing. And for example, Scipione Bargani in the Dialogo dei Giochi, which I cited before, hints repeatedly at the fact that certain games could be orchestrated as improvisation of certain performances. In that case, it was not a real text to be the object of the performance, but it was a situation and the number of characters which were attributed to each and every one of the participants. So as you can see, there is such a huge spectrum of variety between written word and performed word, between reading and staging, between literary text and authorship, as I tried to argue before, and improvisation and play, because theater was essentially a form of entertainment, and sometimes the kind of literary authorship and the, let's say, copyright was by no means the most important factor. So for this reason, going back to your question, which is very vast, so it's difficult to address, it is ultimately impossible to draw a clear-cut perimeter within which a certain text was operating. And in many cases, just like in Donzellini's oltraggi, Amore, Fortuna, the same plot, the same series of characters was molded into multiple forms to fit the specific needs of a performance or of a publication.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Io avrei una domanda a livello linguistico per Anna. Se, non so se hai avuto modo di notare una variazione tra il manoscritto e la prima edizione a livello linguistico, se ci sia magari un abbassamento o una qualsiasi sorta di variazione proprio a livello linguistico tra le due edizioni, diciamo.
Ah sì, te lo dico. No, te lo dico.
Ok.
Dai.
Allora, dal punto di vista linguistico in realtà rimane tutto abbastanza, diciamo, identico nel passaggio dal manoscritto di Yale alla stampa, perché il manoscritto sienese è completamente, diciamo, diverso in tutto, nell'organizzazione della trama, qualche personaggio rimane ma ha un ruolo diverso, quindi quello penso che vada analizzato completamente a parte, ecco. L'unica cosa che posso magari dire che ho notato è sicuramente che magari il fatto di aver eliminato alcuni personaggi, come per esempio Pedante, penso abbia un po' alleggerito anche dal punto di vista linguistico la commedia, perché Pedante è un personaggio pedante, quindi anche molto pesante, possiamo dire così, parla spesso utilizzando dei latinismi eruditi, insomma, particolarmente anche a volte sbagliati, penso a proposito, che anche nel manoscritto comunque rendono magari la lettura o comunque la messa in scena più pesante, mentre invece l'eliminazione di questo personaggio, che spesso fa anche dei monologhi molto lunghi, quindi anche a livello linguistico abbastanza impegnativi da seguire, sia forse un tentativo di snellire un po', no? la commedia per renderla un pochino più digeribile, perché no? Ecco, quindi questo forse è una delle uniche, comunque delle differenze più evidenti dal punto di vista macrostrutturale, linguistico. Poi ovviamente ci sono magari qualche cambiamento più specifico, però ecco, per quello che ho avuto modo di vedere finora, questa è sicuramente una delle cose più evidenti.
Grazie.
Aggiungo che con molta modestia Anna ha detto che è emerso un nuovo manoscritto a Siena, in realtà l'ha scoperto lei. Si dirà che per un accademico intronato andare all'Accademia degli Intronati e alla Biblioteca degli Intronati a Siena è la prima cosa che va fatta. Però rimane il fatto che l'ha scoperto Anna e che questo manoscritto datato 1592 non deve trarre in inganno la stessa data della seconda edizione, ma è una redazione completamente diversa, prima di tutto in 4 atti, non in 5. E secondariamente con un numero enorme di interventi appunto probabilmente rivolti a un adattamento a una compagnia di attori più piccola, magari a degli spazi più ristretti, comunque a una situazione in cui anche il pubblico andava intrattenuto in modo più snello.
La domanda che chiede subito, ma ci sono elementi di storia della storia della rappresentazione? Si sa se è stata rappresentata quando? Niente.
Non si sa.
Niente.
Per ora non si sa, per il buon motivo che fino a poco tempo fa questa era una commedia ritenuta una commedia da leggere, cioè con 2 edizioni a stampa, tra l'altro, ripeto, di un eminente tipografo rinascimentale che è il tipografo che pubblica l'edizione critica, perché è veramente un'edizione critica quella variante, degli Accademici della Crusca, la commedia di Dante, 1595, e che fa ripetutamente riferimento all'atto del leggere. Non ci sono altre testimonianze di performance. Viceversa, nel 2011 è venuto fuori questo manoscritto alla Beinecke, anzi, diciamo che io ho tirato giù dei titoli, in realtà ha cominciato Anna poi a metterci le mani, e nel 2023, cioè 3 mesi fa, 4 mesi fa, è venuto fuori il secondo manoscritto, che sono manoscritti che invece fanno riferimento a un staging, sicuramente. Quindi è una storia, come molto onestamente ha detto Anna, ancora tutta da scrivere. È un lavoro non solo in progress, ma che è cominciato da poco, come anche vedete dalla giovanissima età dell'attrice.
Se posso fare un commento, se capisco bene, però la vostra ipotesi è che il primo manoscritto non è mai stato rappresentato, poi ci sono state delle rappresentazioni e c'è stata pubblicazione. È questa l'ipotesi o?
Sì, esatto, questa sarebbe l'ipotesi più, diciamo, per noi economica e plausibile, diciamo, ecco, per spiegare anche la differenza, no, che è emersa. E poi probabilmente, perché no, magari una nuova rappresentazione in anni più tardi, a quel punto il contesto magari è cambiato, il pubblico è diverso, ha esigenze diverse e quindi una nuova rappresentazione con nuovi personaggi, una trama diversa, come testimonia infatti il manoscritto di Siena. Quindi sicuramente alcune rappresentazioni dopo la data del primo manoscritto, poi dopo il successo delle rappresentazioni, la stampa, e poi dopo, perché no, di nuovo una rappresentazione riscritta completamente, però, ecco, perché a quel punto magari c'erano esigenze completamente diverse. Questa sarebbe l'ipotesi, poi chissà, magari col tempo si emergerà qualche altro dettaglio più interessante, però per ora questo è la nostra ipotesi.
Thank you very much for this lecture. It's especially interesting to me as someone who's sort of dabbled in performance throughout my life. There's been a growing push on, like Broadway, for example, to limit the amount of variance you can have to a text. However, recently there was a restaging of a very famous musical by Stephen Sondheim called Company, about a young bachelor in his mid-30s who has yet to find a wife. And they changed the performance to switch all the genders, so the main character is now a 30-something bachelorette, and it effectively changed the meaning of the musical from being like a comedy about the woes of marriage to become something about like the expectations of women, to, you know, the pressure we put on them to marry and start a family. And I'm wondering, in your experience dealing with these like textual variants from that specific era, from like, you know, the 15th, 16th century, were these variances mostly due to practical reasons, like understanding for the audience or getting rid of minor characters? Or is there an example of something from that time period that similarly is changed to like effectively change the meaning for the audience? Is there an example of a change that drastic from that time period or no?
I'll take this one. That's not a problem. First of all, I'm very happy that you raised the problem of Broadway musicals, because, for example, some people will know that the textual forensics, the philology of the digital text, has started in the first decade of the 21st century with study of the digital variants on floppy disk of the musical Hairspray by Douglas Hyde. The Agriside is considered the father of textual forensics, although the label textual forensics is only used in 2009 by Matthew Kirschenbaum in an article which I urge, Olivia is a student of mine, she knows I urge them to read stuff every time. I urge them to read this article called Textual Forensics that applies a category initially used by David Gretham in 1999 to the textual scholarship of floppy disks and of weak traces which are very vulnerable to time and which are very delicate to maintain accessible during time. Going back to your other questions, that is the sort of performative origin of variants. Yes, no. I mean, this is by all means the most frequent reason for revising and adapting text. But we have plenty of witnesses that actually testify a certain intertextual work with authors trying to, as I said, emphasize the textual bonds with their models, Plautus, Terence, or other vernacular models, and or, for example, try to develop like the psychology or language of characters. This is another very interesting type of variance. The variance whereby authors try to represent a certain mixture of dialects and languages. For example, the soldier speaking Bergamasque, the porter or the servant speaking Paduan, and so on. The comedy of languages, as Ivano Pacagnella has dubbed it. And this is, again, another very interesting chapter, which, anyway, I have absolutely no time to tackle. Thanks. Pier Francesco Cambi.
Forse sono annotazioni che un accademico che si occupa di un testo senese, no, non so che...
Allora, in merito diciamo allo spoglio per inserire poi i lemmi nel primo vocabolario della Crusca, abbiamo testimonianza del fatto che appunto proprio il Cambi probabilmente ha fatto lo spoglio anche della commedia di nostro interesse, probabilmente per registrare qualche utilizzo, ora non proprio del fiorentino appunto perché ovviamente il testo proviene da un'accademia senese, ma sicuramente no, del toscano dell'epoca, e quindi effettivamente dalle immagini che avevo, ora ovviamente non si legge molto bene dall'immagine del manoscritto, però gli elementi, magari la possiamo anche rimettere, ma io non credo che si legga, purtroppo è un po' piccola, però diciamo che gli elementi, le frasi, le espressioni che sono state registrate dal Cambi sono frasi particolari di cui io stessa di molte non ho capito in realtà il significato, quindi probabilmente modi di dire, espressioni proverbiali che magari aveva intenzione poi di inserire, no, tra i vari significati che una parola poteva acquisire all'interno del vocabolario. Io le ho definite annotazioni perché insomma mi sembrava una parola che potesse sintetizzare un po' meglio quello che penso il Cambi avesse intenzione di fare, no?
Questa è un'altra, scusate se lo sottolineo, un'altra acquisizione che dobbiamo a Anna, con l'assistenza dell'archivista dell'Accademia della Crusca, Elisabetta Benucci, bravissima, che ci ha, diciamo, diretto un po', aiutato, ci ha portato sulle tracce di questi spogli.
Perché lei si è occupata del Cambio, no?
Sì, lei è una specialista dei redattori del primo vocabolario del 1612, però ecco, c'è da dire che quindi anche questo, cos'era? Marzo, quindi anche questa è una novità di pochissimi mesi fa e di nuovo molto promettente ma anche un po' prematura.
Certo.
Interessante. Se non ci sono altre domande,
Magari ne parliamo anche giù.
sì, invito a scendere downstairs, some refreshments. Grazie ancora.
Yeah.